everyone. Welcome to season 2 of Carefullist, the podcast. We are so happy to have you with us today, and you are going to love this conversation. I am very happy to welcome Lisa Pahl to talk with us today. She is a community educator, a hospice social worker, and co-creator of the Death Deck. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, Katie. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm very, very excited about this conversation because I think, it's a topic that is on the minds of a lot of people, but they don't know how to ask and they don't know what to talk about. And sometimes you just don't want to talk about it. But before we get into that, I'll leave a little teaser there. I would love to hear your caregiving story and where it started.
Yeah, so I aside from parenting, I've been a caregiver 3 times. The first was with my grandparents. My parents both were 18 and 19 when they got married and started a family, and that has been true of every generation, if not younger, in my family. So I grew up with great grandparents alive until college, with my grandparents alive until just um, 4 years ago. And I'm almost 50. So I've been very fortunate in that way. So my first caregiving experience was from afar and supporting my grandparents. Like many people, they didn't have any one thing wrong that was terminal, but they were constantly in and out of the hospital,
Yeah.
especially my grandma. She did end up dying of pancreatic cancer. And that year, when they were misdiagnosing and lots of things, I was back and forth, being an advocate in the hospital for my grandma, and trying to support my mom, who was really stretched thin, trying to support them.
Yeah.
They had no desire to downsize or make any changes. And so there were so many conversations and so many uh, pivoting of strategies of how to best support. So that was my intro of really being involved. My mother-in-law was my most tender caregiving experience. She died of pancreatic cancer as well. And my husband and I took turns flying back and forth. He would stay a month, I would stay a month. And
Wow.
while she was in Michigan and we were in California. So
Mhm.
that was a really beautiful and excruciatingly hard time.
Yeah.
Um, and then right after that, my friend who'd been dealing with stage 4 cancer, her cancer progressed, and I became her healthcare decision maker and um, support person as she had to move out of her place into a boarding care and help access caregivers. And then I was um, her primary person during that time as well. So those are my three. I will say that I know that there'll be more. Um,
Yeah.
I was recently helping support my dad who was in the hospital. I was home for a couple of weeks then. He's doing well now, but eventually my parents will be most likely in some situations of needing care as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's much more common, I think, than people realize in terms of we talk about caregiving and we talk about sandwich caregiving, which is caring for two generations. But then you've got this whole subset of people who are in like the club sandwich
Mhm.
situation or like a triple decker sandwich where you have your kids, you have your parents, you have your grandparents, and there's so much to manage. And as people move away from where they grew up and families don't live in the same town, you really have to figure out what to do. Um, for their care. So I can imagine that was very difficult for you and your husband spending a month, halfway across the country from one another and then taking turns doing that. You didn't see each other much.
Yeah, no, it was really hard. And my son was 10 at the time, and he had a hard time.
Yeah.
With one of us always being gone. And of course, the person who was left here wasn't at their best because everything was happening back
Yeah.
in. And
Right.
so I was fortunate enough when I was caring for her. On the weekends, my husband's sister and brother-in-law would come stay with her. And so on the
Okay.
weekends, I would take a break and drive to my parents, who were only a couple of hours from where my husband's parents lived. And so I had these mini breaks of
Yeah.
being on my family farm and being able to uh, take a breather, which I know many caregivers don't have that opportunity. So in many
Yeah.
ways, it was very challenging, but in other ways, it was during COVID, which had many challenges, but it also was like a blessing in the sense that the world has shut down. And so all of the extra things that people were doing, they weren't.
Right.
And so, everyone was kind of able to be just there with her.
Yeah. And that is one of the silver linings, if there is such a thing, from the pandemic. It
Hmm.
did equal the playing field quite a bit. When you think about providing care and the world slowing down a bit, and that added element of humanity and people starting to open up because the number of people who were working from home, you heard more and you saw more of people's personal lives. And suddenly you were much more aware of colleagues' personal situations and struggles. So the more conversations I have with folks, that's a common theme that emerges is, one of the good things that came from that is a better understanding and more compassion um, for the folks that we know and what they're going through.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's true. I mean, of course, I saw on the other side because I worked in the ER. I was working in the ER and hospice when COVID first happened in March 2020, and so, as we know, of course, it became that you couldn't see your family members, even the
Right.
dying ones, and so that was so painful of a time for the family members when the patient was living in boarding cares or nursing homes, and then there was a no visiting policy, and
Yes.
so us healthcare workers became you know, the iPad video calls for
Right.
people, and so the families, however, the families that were able to care at home kind of had this beautiful bubble where people weren't expected to be in the office and they weren't expected to be doing
Right.
these evening activities that are often, there weren't any kids sports and the kind of all of these things that
Yeah.
make it hard to juggle everything. So I certainly never would look back on that time fondly.
Oh,
However,
absolutely.
just to be clear, um,
Yeah.
but I do think that the ability, the understanding that we really can work from anywhere, many of us, and that the compassion, like you said, Katie, I think that those are two. And that we can actually slow down and that there are benefits of slowing down.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that can be a really hard thing to focus on, I didn't word that the way I wanted it to, but whatever. Well, we'll just roll with it. Um, is finding joy and maintaining a sense of humor. Sometimes it can be really difficult to maintain a sense of humor. But if you were able to, how did you do that or how did that work for you? And if not humor, I know you mentioned being able to take time and go to your family farm. Um, Obviously that brings you joy. I can see it on your face when you were talking about it. Um, was that a sustaining thing? And is there anything else that you did or that worked for you?
Yeah, well, I definitely believe in humor, using humor in all difficult times and fun times too. My family, um, my dad's goal in life is to make everyone laugh, and so he's kind of the
Yeah.
corny, silly kind of jokester. But I grew up in a house where he would do outrageous things to make people laugh, and so um, I try to bring humor into my hospice work as well
Mhm.
as and bring it to the caregivers as
Yeah.
well as when I was in the role of caregiving. My grandma was really good at, I mean, she could just startle you with her comments, and she just got a kick out of making people uncomfortable, and um, you know always talking about sex here and there, and in like outrageous ways for an 80 something year old woman, and
Yeah.
it was incredible, and so we laughed a lot. My mother-in-law, we had some very fun, funny moments. But it felt more, uh, it was really a condensed time. And so that one,
Yeah.
I think I was more trying to survive and finding
Mhm.
joy. When there were more people around us, I felt like there was a lightness. But when it was her
Yeah.
and I, it felt like we were really in something together. And it was
Right.
harder um, to find that levity. So I think with her, it was more about finding great food that we wanted to eat.
Yeah.
Watching a movie together, trying
Mhm.
to create these special moments.
Yes.
And that felt really good.
Yeah. So you mentioned food, which, I love. I think most people do. Was there a go-to recipe or were you doing takeout from certain places that you really liked? What was the favorite thing there?
Yeah, um I did some cooking, for sure. And but my mother-in-law, she was really determined to just like eat her way around town. So we did
Oh, that's awesome.
we we had one day where she decided um she wanted all of her favorite Chinese food, and so there were three restaurants in town. And so we got egg rolls from one place, we got, her favorite dish from one and her favorite dish from the other.
Yeah.
And we took it to the beach and had a little picnic, and that was one of my favorite
Wow.
moments.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, that is so special. And when you're in a situation like that where you know there isn't going to be the outcome that you want, you have to make moments and experiences that do have the outcome that you want. And that is a perfect example to share with people if any of our listeners are going through something similar. That's a really great idea and a good way to just celebrate being together and doing something that you enjoy.
Yeah, no, it was really special. I feel that resonated what you said. I think that it's so hard when you're in it. It's so hard when you're in it, especially when a person is having a lot of symptoms and they're
Mm.
not feeling up to doing things. And
Right.
so I usually try to encourage people, and how I was looking at it was like, okay, is this a good day? If it's a good day, what do
Yeah.
we want to do?
Right.
We also, Kay is my mother-in-law's name, and we decided that Tuesday were Lisa and Kay Day. And so we had a little sign on the door that said Lisa and Kay Day. Um, and we didn't schedule any of the hospice visits during that time.
Yeah.
And she didn't have any neighbors coming by or anything. Because what we found was, I mean, caregiving is exhausting, and so is being the patient, right? And
Yes.
you're trying to take all the medications and eat well and have a bowel movement, which can
Mm-hmm.
be a whole other thing. And so um, I think that I think carving out that time, and I was fortunate enough that Kay is a very sentimental person, and um, she treated that time as the precious time that it was, you know.
Yeah.
And and I think, we don't always have that awareness and that acceptance.
Right.
She went straight from diagnosis to hospice. And
Oh,
so um, while that was really challenging, she felt pretty good for a while because
yeah.
she didn't do any treatment. And so
Right.
um, so we had this precious time. I don't know if you know Jennifer O'Brien's work. She wrote The Hospice Doctor's Widow.
Yes.
Um, so she coined, her husband, who is a hospice and palliative care physician, coined the term precious time. And that's how he would talk to his families and the patient and kind of say, we know this is precious time. Basically, we
Yeah.
know the time is pretty short for this person, and so
Mhm.
be intentional with how you use this time,
Right.
which can feel like a ton of pressure for some people, but I think it also helps. I try to be really upfront with people working in hospice with the family. If they want to know our best guess on how long this is going to be,
Mhm.
I've worked in hospice 18 years now. We can typically, not always, typically give a pretty good indication
Right.
of how long. And, that can be so helpful because when people say,
Yes.
I'm going to have to do this for 2 more years, and we're
Hmm.
saying, it's probably more like a month, that
Yeah.
shifts perspective, right? And what
Right.
seems unbearable now becomes this window of time of like, okay, what do I want to do with this precious time I have left?
Right. Yeah. And the thing that you mentioned and made me think it doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It doesn't have to be a huge trip. It can be if that's what you want and that's within your means and all of that, but it doesn't have to be because it's really about, you know, spending time with the people that you love and making memories for both of you.
Mhm.
So that image you gave me of being on the beach and eating Chinese food is so wonderful. And if
Mhm.
you don't have a beach near you, then, maybe you have a really great park or a water fountain or, something that evokes good feelings and peace and calm, and you can have conversation with the people you're with.
Mhm.
Um, and it doesn't always have to be with people. If you have a dog and you want to take your dog,
Mhm. Mhm.
you know, I, it's all okay. It really is what matters to you and the person that you're caring for, the person who's receiving the care. So I did not expect us to go down that road with this conversation, but that's what I love about these conversations because these wonderful nuggets come up that I know people can use and benefit from. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Um,
I it made me think when my friend Debbie was on hospice, our activity that we did, well, we had two. We would do a happy hour at the boarding care and bring in margaritas and little snacks and she took a lot of medication to help her enjoy that little bit of margarita. And but oh, we had so much fun. And then her and I would take her in the car we'd have a bunch of blankets and we'd just sit in the car and watch the sunset. And
Nice.
and then we'd talk about what food we were gonna get on the way
Yeah.
back and then go back and eat it. And but that I often encourage my families, just if you can get them a person in the car,
Yeah.
even just to drive,
Hmm.
just if they have the ability and they feel up to it and nausea isn't too bad and all these things, um, e- people typically tend to feel, like they're back out in the world, even just
Yes.
in the car ride, right? Because it can
Yep.
get so the walls can just start to feel like you're closing in
Hmm.
um, when you're sick. And so, yeah, even a simple car ride, I think, can be. And then you're also you're not in necessarily the same caregiving role at that time too. It
Right.
can it can feel more like, okay, mom, we're. Just running to the store. It
Yeah.
can feel more, um,
Normal.
no, yeah, that's kind of more normal, more like a back in time kind of moment. Yeah,
Right. Yeah. What your relationship was before this big ugly thing joined the crowd.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good description.
Yeah. So, a couple of things. You mentioned boarding care. Can you explain for the audience what boarding care is in case they're not familiar?
Sure. So that is typically a house that looks like a regular house. It might be a little bit bigger than a typical house, but there's usually 4 to 6 residents and um, two caregivers during the day, often one at night. And these are alternatives to in-home caregiving and alternatives to skilled nursing facilities. They tend to be more affordable than either option, and they tend to, in my experience here in the LA of California, they can give more attention than nursing homes can give. Um, they are typically better suited for people that need care. We have assisted living facilities as well, where people can kind of, there could be these stages where they're pretty independent. Um, the challenge that I see with assisted living facilities, they can be great for a very long time, but they aren't always set up to um, be able to care one-on-one for someone as they're dying or provide that level of care.
Right.
And so some of our patients will transfer from an assisted living to a smaller setting so that they can
Hmm.
get the care that they need. Because typically what the assisted living facility will do is they'll charge for the caregiving on top of the assisted living fee that you're no longer utilizing all those activities and meals and services. So
Right.
um, now some people who've lived in the assisted living um, residential care for 10 years, that's their home. And so
Yeah.
keeping someone there if you have the financial means is the best, for the person.
Hmm.
But for some people, they've been there a short period of time, or they've been there a couple of years, or their dementia has progressed to a point where they really need more
Yeah.
personalized care. So, yeah, I would say in California, I mean, we have a lot of boarding cares,
Hmm.
and there are specialists who can help you kind of find
Okay. Well, that's good. That
all
was
the
my
different
next
boarding
question.
cares. It can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
Uh, But for anyone who's working, or anyone, if you have access to palliative care or hospice care, there's always a social worker assigned that can assist with, recommendations and
Mhm.
referrals and kind of guide you through that process too.
That's great. Thank you.
Mhm.
So, when we're thinking about hospice in particular, when should that conversation begin? Because in my personal experience, we found that it should happen much sooner than you might expect, depending on the disease and the situation.
Yeah, I mean, so we now have, it used to be that palliative care was this team in the hospital that um, would talk to a family if the hospital system or the physicians felt like we're not sure we can help this person anymore and we think that they should, go home on hospice. That was basically the conversation.
Mhm.
Um, in many areas of the country, palliative care has expanded to be able to provide support outside of the hospital setting and provide an extra layer of support upon diagnosis. So if you
Mhm.
received a serious illness diagnosis, let's say a stage 3 or stage 4 cancer, um, palliative care could come in and assist with managing your symptoms. But they also are specialists in having conversations about um, what you want this time to look like.
Mhm.
What is your quality of life for you? What is a point that you can accept in terms of your functional status? And beginning to have those conversations early means that it reduces some of the anxiety and conflict within the family because it isn't just kind of sprung on them.
Yeah.
It's a slow buildup. Um, it's conversations over time, which are always
Mhm.
better than crisis. So, so I encourage people if your family member has a diagnosis, a serious illness diagnosis, a terminal diagnosis, to ask for hospice or palliative care, depending on how severe and advanced it is. With hospice, the person has to have a prognosis of 6 months or less, and that isn't the case with palliative care. There is no time here in the States, there's no time specific prognosis there. So, however, I will say that in rural areas and some places in the country, there isn't much in terms of palliative care. It pretty much is just hospice
Yeah.
or you're in the hospital. So, but starting these conversations early, we created a couple tools to help people kind of start talking about what they would want while aging and towards end of life. And I think the more we have these conversations in your 40s, 50s, 60s, like even younger, young people, the more comfortable we are talking about these topics and the less overwhelming it seems if someone brings up the H word, like, oh no, hospice.
Right.
Um, and I'll tell you, I mean, uh, the the statistics show us that people actually live longer on hospice than without in many diseases. And that's because you have the support coming in. You have nursing
Mhm.
care every week, you have supplies and medications delivered, you have this entire team to be managing symptoms and supporting the patient and family. So
Yeah.
oftentimes people will kind of do a little better on hospice, especially if they come on early.
Yep.
If they come on early and they're not really close to the end of their life, then we have the ability to improve quality of life and have more enjoyable time with family. So,
Yeah. That happened for us. My mom had the hospice bump in a big way. She was put on hospice in February of 2020. And they said, given all of these things, and for those of you who aren't familiar, they come in and they do an evaluation and, they check all of these boxes. And depending how many of those boxes the person checks, either you're ready for hospice or you're not. And my mom was ready. So they put her on hospice and she actually lived 3.5 years, which
Yeah,
is not necessarily the norm. You don't get that kind of a bump, but because she had dementia and nothing else wrong with her, um, she got a big bump.
yeah, yeah. Well, and that happens sometimes. I mean, I think we have this, um, there is a misconception, of course, that hospice is just for the very end of life. And it's not, it's,
Right.
an estimation of 6 months or less. But as long as the person continues to qualify for hospice during these recertification periods, then they can remain on hospice, and I think,
Yeah.
um, I mean, what a gift that she had that support, and you all had that support for
It
that
was
length of time.
wonderful.
Yeah.
I am the biggest proponent of hospice. When my dad said, I'm going to call just to have them come and give me an idea of when they might need to come back and evaluate her. We were thrown when they said, actually, we think it's time because our experience with hospice or knowledge of hospice rather was, oh, well, they call hospice in when you've got a month or a few weeks or something like that. But really, the sooner you involve hospice, the better, because as you said, they provide all of the supplies you need. You have people coming in and checking on you. You, as the caregiver, have support. Our hospice team was wonderful. And I would highly recommend if you think you're getting close or if you're not sure. I mean, the worst they can do is say you're not ready yet, but that's also good news.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you can also, you can self-refer to hospice. I think people don't realize that. They think that they have to, um, go talk to their doctor and get their doctor to refer them, but you can actually self-refer, you can refer a family member. The hospice team um, they will reach out to the PCP, they'll reach out to follow up with the process and get a referral.
Mm.
But people can take it upon themselves, especially because sometimes um, physicians don't have great information about hospice and they don't always refer early. And they will
Yeah.
even tell families who ask, we're not there yet. And then they ignore that and then they still come to us.
Hmm.
And the person's gone in a couple of weeks. It's like you said that they
Right.
weren't there yet. You don't actually know. I
Yeah. Or they're
um
avoiding having a difficult conversation.
yeah, yeah. That's the case. And I know it's difficult. I've talked to a lot of um physicians and MPs, and I know that, there's so many nuances of going into how receptive is the family to having these conversations and
Yep.
what are the vibes we're getting from them, and at what point do we pause and say,
Mhm.
let's think about where this is all going, you
Right.
know? So I recognize it's very hard, but that's why I try to empower and educate like you're doing, Katie. Like, this is what hospice looks like. If your person has been back and forth to the hospital frequent times, if they've lost
Mhm.
weight, if they, used to be able to kind of get around the house and now they're bedbound, these are really
Mhm.
big indicators that end of life is approaching and that they may
Mhm.
qualify for hospice. And um, most of the time, I hear families tell me how much they wish they had known about hospice sooner and how they had
Yeah.
wished they had gotten the support sooner because they
Right.
could have really. use the help, you know.
Yeah. I am here to shout it from the rooftops. Don't put it off. It's a scary concept because you're confronting reality that you wish wasn't true.
Yeah.
But when you make that phone call and they show up, it's like somebody's sending in the cavalry. You
Mhm.
know, if you've seen the Avengers movie Endgame, you know, and they're like on your left and all the people start showing up. There is that relief feeling that you're not in it so much by yourself. So yeah, make that phone call if you think that you're near because it it is so worth it.
Well, and I was just going to add, you know, Medicare does have um, um, Medicare.gov does have a compare provider so that you can actually look at the ratings, the patient and family satisfaction ratings of the hospices. And hospices are given ratings. And so that can be really helpful if you can search by area, zip code, and it can list, you know, all of the different providers, which is a little easier if you don't live in LA where there's like 10,000
A million of
providers.
them.
But but you know, we've recently had patients referred to our hospice, or they've come onto our hospice because they were receiving bad care with another hospice. And so I like to, you know, encourage people to put feelers out with, just like if you needed to hire a personal caregiver, um, try to get the personal referral for a hospice if you have, you know,
Yeah,
someone who just went through it with their parent or um, someone that you really trust. And then looking at the Medicare website to look at the
yeah.
ratings so that you can,
Thank
I
you for
mean,
sharing that.
use your, we can only do what we have with the information we have, right?
Yeah,
You can change hospice providers if you feel like they aren't being responsive to the symptoms, if they're not being responsive to your calls. You can transfer hospices. You don't need their permission. You can just call up another hospice and they will make it happen. So,
yeah,
um, obviously, I would always encourage people to talk to them first and try to remedy the situation, but know that you have the right. And if you are in a hospital system and you're working with a care managers or case managers or social workers, and they tell you, oh, well, this is the hospice we use, they're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to give you a list of choices. And
hmm,
you don't even have to choose anyone on that list. You can choose anyone you want. It doesn't matter who your doctor refers you to. It doesn't matter what your hospital system refers you to. It doesn't matter if, you know, you went to a Providence hospital, so you have to go to Providence Hospice. No. Most of the time, they can't even see the notes from the hospital stay. So
wow,
we think there's all these benefits, but you,
yeah.
consumers have the right to choose whatever hospice that they want to choose. So,
Oh, that's so good to know. And thank you for sharing that resource. I didn't know about that. So we will make sure that we get Medicare.gov and the link to the hospice rating system included on Carefullist.com. Um, One of the things that you mentioned earlier, and of course, we want to make sure that we talk about this, is you are the co-creator of something called the Death Deck. And you have another deck called EOL, which stands for End of Life. So, talk with us about what those are and how you use them and the groups of people that could benefit from each one.
sure. Yeah, so we created the Death Deck in 2018. I created it with Lori Cicero, and she was the spouse of a hospice patient of mine. And so we had come together to see how we could help people have conversations about what they would want um, at end of life while they were dying, if they couldn't speak for themselves. And so the death deck has 112 questions. We use multiple choice and we use a lot of humor to try to lighten the topic up. And that deck, the purpose is to really just kind of get conversations started. We found that adding the humor, even if it's kind of a groan or an eye roll, or it loosens people up a little bit. It
Yeah.
helps them not take the topic quite as seriously, and being able
Yeah.
to just have the conversation without feeling as anxious about it. Um, and so that uh, asks a lot of questions about all things death related. And the purpose is so that, you could play it kind of with couples and in a
Mhm.
party game kind of setting, but also there are, about the third of the deck is advanced care planning questions. And so we really use that to be a tool for people who are trying to initiate these conversations of advanced care planning for um, uh, healthcare professionals, doulas, um, geriatric care managers,
Mhm.
everyone who's trying to get people talking on these topics and doing some preparatory work. And then
Yeah.
the EOL deck we created in 2023, and that's our softer deck. So that is really what I've been using with mostly with my hospice patients, although some of my hospice patients have like a really great sense of humor. And so we dive into the death deck and have a great time. But I usually caution end of life professionals and family members know the person that they're supporting in a
Yeah.
much better and deeper way. So you know what I now do, if I'm going to be totally transparent, is I have some cards from the death deck and some cards from the EOL deck, kind of my favorites and the ones that I feel like are most beneficial in hospice setting. And I
Mhm.
just kind of pull out the ones that best fit for that family and that patient.
Yeah.
Um, but it can be really hard, especially when you're caregiving for a family member. It can be really hard to initiate these conversations.
Yeah.
Um, you know, we sometimes people tell me, well, I just bought the game and I just set it out and I waited, for them to notice and start a conversation.
Mhm.
Other people have listened to me talk and then kind of blamed it on, oh, I heard this podcast or I heard this webinar and they were talking about this thing. I just want to try it, just trying to give an in for the
Yep.
conversation.
We're
Um,
happy to be your in. You can use us as an excuse.
yeah, and I think, you in a lot of ways, it can work well to start with questions that aren't as personal. They're kind of
Mhm.
more like, what are your thoughts on this topic, right?
Yeah.
Can mediums communicate with the dead? That's that one. People usually have thoughts, sometimes stories.
Mhm.
Um, it's not necessarily what do you want as you're dying, to start with that question kind of thing. So I usually encourage people to start with farther away and then kind of as the conversation is going,
Mhm.
you can kind of bring it more personal. But the other thing is when you're holding a card, there's a little barrier between the two of you,
Yep.
and you can blame the card for asking the question. So I find that helpful. I find that
Yeah.
helpful with patients because it can just feel so vulnerable trying to talk through some of these topics. Um, Now, I will say if a deck of cards, if you're looking for other ideas, I always encourage people to use TV shows or movies, put on a show that has some themes of aging and illness and um, uh, or a podcast or an article,
Mhm.
or you can use the help of someone else.
Yep.
Oh, buddy down the street just had a stroke. I hear they're not sure, she's on a ventilator. I wouldn't want that. You know, these conversations that kind of can happen
Right.
organically are great ways to just open the door to see what your family member is thinking about these topics.
Yeah.
Because I know it can feel super sensitive, but in my experience, people who need care are thinking about these topics. They're thinking about
Right.
their death. They're thinking about how it's going to go. They're wondering, you know, what's going to happen when they need more care. They are thinking of these topics, and not talking about it just means both of you are individually stressed out internally
Yeah.
and nothing is getting done about it, you know. And even when we just start the conversation, we have a place to return to. And I
Right.
think that'd be helpful, because sometimes it does take a fall or something to change.
Hmm.
You know, some people will refuse to have anyone in their home until their hand is forced.
Yeah.
But we can give it our all to try.
That's right. And one of the things that is a common theme in these conversations that I'm having, um, is that you need to have these conversations sooner than you think. And the best time to have these conversations is when there isn't a problem, right? So maybe you get the death deck now while everybody's healthy, knowing at some point you're going to need care, they're going to need care, somebody's going to need to give the care. Excuse me. So play the game and start having the conversations. And if you don't have a living will,
Mhm,
you really should.
mhm,
Because the fact of the matter is things happen, right? And you don't have to be 85 years old for it to happen. It can happen sooner.
mhm,
Um, and it's not a fun topic, but you can respond so much better if you have a plan in place already.
mhm,
Um, and you can spend the time you have left, the precious time you have left, on the things that you want to do rather than these logistical types of conversations.
yeah, yeah. Oh, I have so many thoughts on that. This is like my favorite topic, but I'll try to keep them brief. I think um, it it is so hard to be grieving when there's been a mess left behind. It's just
Yes.
so challenging. I provide bereavement call after one of my patient dies. I check in on the family, see how they're doing. I can't tell you how many sad and mad family members I talk to who discovered that their family member was not prepared for their death. Um,
Mhm.
Even with the knowledge that they're on hospice. And so they don't have passwords, they don't know where the life insurance policy is, they don't know, they can't access the bank account. It's just and even when things are prepared for, it takes about a solid year to get like an estate resolved
Yep.
when everything is tied up with a bow. And so if it's not, it's just so exhausting, especially with small family systems where the burden is on like one or two people.
Hmm.
So I know none of us want to do this type of preparation, but it it really is a gift that you're giving to your family that you've done that.
Yes.
And then I think the other huge piece of why to have these conversations early is because the piece of paper is not usually what guides family members. You know, if you have a medical crisis, they're not usually waiting around for an advanced directive from the attorney to be placed
Hmm.
in the physician's hands. It's really like, who's at the bedside? What do they say you want? And
Hmm.
so medical professionals are gonna do all heroic measures unless they're told not to. And so if um, if you haven't had those conversations, it is really hard to have the confidence to know what your person would want. And so
Yep.
most people err on the side of saying, okay, go ahead. Um, when we look statistically, many people would not want that to be the decision.
Right.
But they just don't have the confidence because they can't
Mhm.
hear the person's words in their head. So that's why we created these products, is to try to create these moments that you can listen, you can like recall that moment. My dad
Yes.
told me recently that if we ever, his exact words, pointing his finger at me like this in a very stern voice that I haven't heard him use since I was a child. And he said, if you ever put a feeding tube in me, I will haunt you. And I
Yeah.
mean, he was, and yeah, I'll never forget that moment, right?
Right.
And we had had many conversations before, but there was something he had found out about a friend and who he felt like would never want to be in the situation he was in. And so he was
Hmm.
really clear about, not me, not that way. And
Yep.
so I find that so helpful, right? Because now
Yes.
it's like, okay, noted.
Right. I will absolutely not do that because I don't need you haunting me.
Exactly, exactly. And I talked to my mom and my brother about it. We're a small family. And
Hmm.
I said, this is what dad said. And they're like, oh yeah, that tracks. So we all have that information, right? We all know that
Yeah.
this is, um, and so I also had them, this is another great tool maybe for you to add, but Compassion and Choices has a dementia directive now that
Hmm.
you can add on to your advanced directive. Um, and
Ah.
it's incredible because it talks about it at different moments of a dementia diagnosis as
Hmm.
it progresses. Would you want comfort measures only? Would you want like
Oh,
moderate
wow.
interventions, or would you want, kind of the everything done kind of thing?
Oh, that's
So
awesome. Yes, we will add that as
it's
well.
it's a fantastic tool because dementia is on the rise and people are very fearful of living
Yeah.
with dementia for a long period of time. And I think this tool helps not only have conversations, but also um, have a little something in writing to return to that can
Yes.
help guide people um, later when the person might not be able to make their own decisions or communicate
Right.
as easily about the topic. So,
Yeah. And that's one that you want to do while you're healthy
mhm.
because having that conversation by the time people get diagnosed, they've already lost a fair amount of their cognition in a lot of cases because people don't want to talk about having a problem. And then when people start to notice there's a problem, you're further out of the train station than you think you are.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And often, we're depending on the type of dementia, but often the emotional capacity to handle
Mhm.
these conversations is also diminished. So it's like the
Yeah.
cognitive and then the EQ, the emotional intelligence piece of being able to talk through
Yeah.
some of these important topics. So yeah, that is a really great tool. I'm actually working on a dementia deck next. And so I'm with Compassion and Choices consent and collaboration. I'm kind of using
Yeah.
some of those things from their dementia directive to spark
Mhm.
some conversations. And again, trying to add a little playfulness, add just a
Yeah.
little uh, not insensitivity, but just kind of like
Right.
a different way to talk about it.
Yeah.
So that should be
Whatever
coming
gets
out
people
this
talking
year.
about it and not clamming up is the name of the game.
Exactly, exactly. Yes. And yeah, and I think if people are interested in having some of these conversations just in general, and your family member doesn't want to have these conversations, there are death cafes across the country, across the world,
Mhm.
but they also have virtual ones that people can attend virtually, because I know it's so hard to attend anything when you're caregiving. Um,
Yeah.
but COVID has taught us that we can do a lot of things virtually. And so there
Yes.
are these death cafes. My friend and I, Stephanie Elkins, she created Death Over Drafts, which is like a death cafe, except for that we have different topics. We go into breweries and we play the death deck, or we have an author speak for a little bit and have people engage in conversations about the topic. We also offer quarterly Zoom death over drafts. And so people can pop in and kind of learn a little bit about a topic or have some conversations. A lot of the people who are in those groups are end of life professionals, and we offer, support and guidance for people who are coming in kind of
Mhm.
saying, uh, what do I do right now? Do you think my person qualifies for hospice? We sometimes get people who are just looking for a little check-in, a little
Yeah.
guidance. Um, so there's a lot of ways now to kind of explore a little bit of this topic.
Mhm.
Um, but my gentle nudge for people is that if you're caregiving for someone, they know that most of the time, I mean, there are chronic illness situations that the person is not approaching end of life, but in many situations, they know they're approaching end of life. And
Mhm.
many of my patients tell me, no one will talk about it, you know. I had this man who was just like, he was so mad. He's just like, My family refuses to talk about the fact that I'm dying. And here I am on hospice. I thought when I got on hospice, people would like finally talk to me about what was going on, but they still are tiptoeing around the topic. And,
Yeah.
um, and of course, we don't want to think about our family member dying. We don't want to think about losing them. And so, a coping strategy is avoidance. And so we might avoid it, but um, you know, when we do that, we miss out on some pretty beautiful moments and conversations, and it can sometimes make the person in the bed feel more alone, you know.
That's what I was, excuse me, that's what I was just going to say is sometimes when we are so inward about how it's affecting us and the thought of losing that person and how difficult it's going to be for us, we don't give them the opportunity to talk to us about how hard this is for them.
Yeah.
They are the one who's dying.
Mhm.
And that's, I mean, I haven't been in that position yet, but that's got to be one of the loneliest seats in the house.
Yeah.
Um, so any tool that will help people have these conversations is extremely helpful. So you can find the death deck on carefullist.com, as well as many other places. It's on Amazon, you have your own website.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and the other tool I thought of while we were talking about how long it can take to pull all this information together, especially if the person hasn't done it for you. So if you're looking to pull all of your information into one place, there's a tool called the knock box.
Mhm.
It's the next of kin box. That there's also a link on our site for that. It guides you step by step of the types of information that you need to pull together to make things easier for folks after you've passed.
Mhm.
So thank you, Lisa Pahl, for joining us today. If you haven't gotten the death deck, now is your chance. Start having some conversations because it's really important that everyone who loves you knows what you want. And it's important that you know what they want at the end of their life as well. Thank you, Lisa Pahl of the Death Deck, for joining us today and for educating everyone on hospice and the types of conversations that we all need to be having with our family members and our close friends.
Thank you, Katie. I really enjoyed our conversation today. And one last thing, you can reach out to me on our website, thedeathdeck.com, or my email is lisa@thedeathdeck.com. So if you have follow-up questions from this conversation or you want to get in touch, I'm happy to connect and offer any support that you need.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again. And we will look forward to everyone joining us on the next episode of Carefullist, the podcast.